Siege warfare is one of the most fascinating aspects of military history. There's just something about seeing thousands of men locked in mortal combat for months on end that really makes me glued to the page when reading about it. And there are so many sieges in history that it's almost impossible to pick out which ones were the best or worst. For example, I would argue that the siege of Leningrad during World War II was one of the greatest tragedies in human history. However, I think we can all agree that the bloodiest siege ever, with more casualties than the other three worst sieges combined, was the siege of Verdun. Today we will look at this siege and why it was so bloody. Before we start, I want to ask you guys for a favor. As you know, I release 2 videos every week, and it takes a lot of time and effort to research and make these videos. However, I also have a day job, and sometimes my work hours are so long that I don't have time to create a second video in a given week. The problem is that posting only once a week isn't ideal, because then you guys might forget about the channel and not return when I post my next video. So please help me by subscribing to my newsletter, where I post once a week about interesting topics from history. It'll be linked down below. Thank you very much. Verdun is a small town in what is now northeastern France. In 1914, it was located near the front lines between France and Germany. When the war began, Verdun was occupied by German forces, but by February 1916, French troops had advanced and recaptured the town. German High Command decided that they needed to recapture the town, so they amassed a large force and launched an offensive against the French positions. Despite fierce fighting, by February, the Germans had managed to break through the French lines and enter the town. With their left flank collapsing, the French were forced to retreat to the nearby forest of Wouvre. This created a salient or bulge in the French lines centered around Verdun. The Germans quickly realized that this was an excellent strategic position, and they decided to try and destroy the French forces inside the salient and capture the town. On February, the Germans began a massive artillery bombardment of the French positions, followed by infantry attacks. The French were able to hold off the German assaults, but they suffered heavy casualties. The fighting continued throughout the day, and by nightfall, the Germans had captured about half of the town. By March, the fighting had become even more intense. The Germans launched wave after wave of infantry attacks, but the French were able to hold them off. However, the Germans were eventually able to force the French back into the forest. This ended the siege of Verdun, and the Germans had taken possession of the town. The Germans began to fortify their positions and prepared to defend against a counterattack. Meanwhile, the French began to regroup and plan their defense of Verdun. They knew that the Germans were planning to attack, but they weren't sure where the main attack would come from, so they decided to dig defensive trenches all around the salient. This turned out to be a wise decision because on August the Germans launched a massive offensive against the French. The Germans attacked along the entire front line, but their main attack was in the center near Verdun. The French were expecting the attack and were able to hold off the German assaults. The fighting continued for several weeks, but the Germans were eventually forced to retreat. After the failed offensive, the fighting continued at a lower intensity. The Germans launched occasional attacks, but for the most part, both sides were content to dig in and wait for the other side to make a mistake. Neither side was able to gain any significant ground until September, when the Germans launched another major offensive. The Germans had dug elaborate tunnels under the French lines and then filled them with explosives. At dawn on September, the Germans detonated the explosives, blowing up several of the French trenches. This allowed the Germans to capture a large portion of the salient. The French were able to mount a counterattack and retake some of the lost ground, but the fighting was costly for both sides. On November, the French launched a major offensive of their own. They attacked along the entire front line, but their main effort was focused on retaking the town of Verdun. After 4 days of fighting, the French were able to capture the town. The Germans fought to the last man, and over 10,000 German soldiers were killed in the fighting. The French victory at Verdun was a major turning point in the war. It marked the end of Germany's last major offensive on the Western Front and showed that the Germans were not invincible. It also gave the French a much-needed morale boost and helped to keep alive the French belief in victory. Why was the Battle of Verdun so bloody? Well, first of all, this was before the era of total war. Even though millions of people would die, the generals still thought that battles could be won quickly. For example, in the American Civil War, General Scott thought that the war would be over in 90 days. So generals would often throw men into battle without thinking about the consequences. If a certain assault failed, the general would simply order another assault with fresh troops. Also, before the era of modern medicine, a wound that would normally be treated and result in a few weeks of leave could mean death on the battlefield. For example, a broken leg would be cleaned, set and bandaged. Then the soldier would be sent back to the front. Most of the men who died at Verdun didn't die because of enemy fire. Instead, they died from disease or wounds that became infected. In fact, one of the biggest killers of men at Verdun was trench foot, which occurred when a soldier's feet would become swollen and infected due to standing in water for long periods of time. So if you wanted to survive the Battle of Verdun, the most important thing was to stay out of the hospital. That was usually a death sentence. As the battle dragged on, the hospitals became so overwhelmed that they started releasing men who were wounded but still able to fight. They would get a few days to recover, then they would be sent back to the front. Another reason why the Battle of Verdun was so bloody is because the generals didn't fully understand the principles of trench warfare. For example, they would often order frontal assaults against enemy trenches. This resulted in heavy casualties for both sides. It wasn't until later in the war that generals began to learn the importance of using artillery and other weapons to destroy enemy trenches before launching an assault. If you enjoyed this video, I highly recommend watching a documentary called They Shall Not Pass, which covers the Battle of Verdun in detail. I found it to be very informative, and it did a good job of capturing the horror of the battle. Verdun was one of the bloodiest battles in history, but it wasn't the only one. In fact, Verdun is often considered to be one of the 5 or 6 deadliest battles of all time. To put Verdun in context, more than 1 million men fought at Verdun, and about 1% of them survived. More men died at Verdun than in the entire 30 Years' War. And the fighting at Verdun was more intense than anywhere else on the Western Front during World War I. At the end of the war, the Germans held the town of Verdun, but it was no longer a strategic asset. By this time, the war had become a stalemate, and Verdun was in a ruined state. It had been bombarded so heavily that it was almost entirely destroyed. The town was captured by the Germans again in 1940, but it was recaptured by the Allies later that year. Today, the town of Verdun is a popular tourist destination. Visitors come from all over the world to see the battlefields and the cemeteries where so many young men died. Verdun is a reminder of the cost of war and the importance of peace. It is also a reminder of the bravery of the men who fought there. These men were ordinary people who were caught up in an extraordinary event. They fought with courage and determination, and they deserve our respect. So that's the story of the bloodiest siege in history. Let me know what you thought of the video in the comments below. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. Thanks for watching.